I would see things. Ultra vivid and lifelike hallucinations, floating images, and great bursts of flashing light would strike me without notice at all hours of the day. In some instances, I have seen all the air around me filled with tongues of living flame. I can remember my teeth chattering uncontrollably out of fear many times as a child. The condition was very hard to handle in those early years of my life, when I was being spoken to and an object was mentioned by name. Just hearing the words would very often trigger my brain into hallucinating the objects mentioned in the conversation. The hallucinations seemed to always be connected to whatever thoughts were floating through my mind. So, if my father asked me to fetch his boots, it would turn out to be a more difficult task than he knew. I would look towards the coat rack, see a pair of boots, and then reach my hand outwards towards a pair of boots, only to find myself empty-handed as I reached for boots that did not exist. I was unable to distinguish which objects I saw were real and which ones my brain had created. It made parts of my boyhood very troubling. I practically had no one whom I could confide in about this, and it made the pain of losing my brother so much more unbearable because I was told he may have had similar issues. It would have been a relief to share this confusion with someone who could understand. I still have the hallucinations, although the attacks were by far the worst during my childhood and early adulthood. I have never met an expert in psychology or biology who could come up with a sound answer as to why they occur. According to their responses, it would seem that I am the only person on God's earth to have ever suffered these particular peculiar experiences. I don't know how that could be true. I realize this sounds very strange. But please believe me, these hallucinations are not to be associated with what you might call a psychotic disorder, such as schizophrenia. I have always been in possession of a sound and healthy mind, free of delusions. My mental faculties have never failed me, and these have never been the type of hallucinations that come with extreme mental illness. I assure you I am well. At first, and for a long time, the hallucinations were only of things I had actually seen in real life. The hallucinations would very often be associated with something I had a very strong emotional response towards, or whatever I happened to be thinking about at that specific time. For example, once I had attended a funeral with my parents. It was probably my first funeral, making it a new experience for me. I was much more alert and aware of my surroundings, just as any person tends to be when having a new experience. All this stimulation was a perfect recipe to trigger my hallucinatory responses. I was surrounded by people mourning and chatting at the funeral. There were speeches and a sermon. The sight of that old dead man's face lying there in the open casket left only a small impression at the time. But later that night, however, I was thinking deeply upon the ideas of death and mortality for the first time as a child. As my thoughts tended to materialize into hallucination, I was given a much deeper impression of that man's face yet again that evening. I was truly terrified as I continued to see the man's lifeless face wherever I looked, upon the walls and the ceilings and the floors. When the images scared me, my only defense was to try to think of something else. If my mind could just let go and think of other things or objects, I would hallucinate about those things instead. This, however, is much easier said than done, believe it or not. Once an idea took a hold of my mind, it was very hard not to think about it. It took me years to master this simple act. One day, I was having trouble doing just this. An image that bothered me was appearing everywhere I looked. I simply couldn't focus my mind to think of something else, something happy that could replace my uncomfortable hallucination. And so I walked outside. Maybe a walk could help calm me, I thought. After all, a walk would change my view and my immediate visual field. Going for sudden walks to change my mood was a great turning point for me. I slowly gained control over these hallucinations, and soon I found if I was not anxious and I approached my hallucinations with calmness and a positive outlook, it became very fun for me. When I began to do this, I no longer hallucinated only the things I had seen before. I began to hallucinate things I had never seen. When I learned to just let go and enjoy my thoughts, I was taken for quite a ride. My only explanation is that somehow the parts of the brain which created vivid, never-before-seen images while dreaming was somehow connected to my waking brain. It is truly fascinating to me, and I believe that in years to come, scientists will make striking discoveries about the complexity of the human brain. Perhaps one day there will be a machine that can connect to the human brain that will show projections of our working thoughts in the form of moving pictures. I went on countless journeys, experiencing dream-like travels simply by staring out into space. As a restless teenager, I would sit in a chair and just take a few breaths. I would look upon the wall for many minutes until the smooth surface would begin to form gentle waves. As I continued to gaze, eventually the wall would cave in completely and then morph into another world. I met people inside these awake dreams. I went to places, cities, and countries I had never known before. These were not real places, of course, but as real to me as the typewriter I see before me now. I had conversations, and overheard stories, and experienced an entire world separate from our reality. Because it was so fun, I did this constantly until I was about 17. Right around that age, I began to realize these images I saw were truly a gift from God. This was because I was becoming passionate about inventing for the first time. So, to my inexpressible joy, I had harnessed my abilities and I could control the hallucinations. By that point, I could see what I wanted to see. For my inventions, I did not need to produce models or drafts, drawings, and many times I did not even need to conduct experiments. I could imagine all the tiniest details of my inventions and literally see a manifestation right in front of my eyes as I looked out into space. I could imagine the inventions and they would appear before me in midair. I could lift my arm and outstretch it, watching my hand pass right through the object I was hallucinating. You see, I was born to be an inventor.